Welcome to This Explainer. We're going to dive right in today, mapping out the epic ancient migrations of Abraham and tackling the highly controversial conquest of Canaan head-on. We're crossing geography, centuries of history, and some really fierce theological debate. So let's just get right into it. But before we even touch the moral complexities of the biblical conquests, we actually have to look at the dirt itself. The foundational question our sources pose is simple, but man, is it explosive. Who actually owned this land? To answer that, we've got to rewind the clock.
Section 1. Abraham's Journey. To really understand the dispute over this territory, our texts trace the footsteps of a single man across the ancient Middle East. Abraham's monumental migration started with a divine calling in a grueling 600-mile trek. He went from Ur of the Chaldees, that's about 50 miles south of Babylon, all the way up to Haran. Now just think about that distance for a second. This wasn't a quick weekend trip, right? This was pure survival.
And from Haran, he didn't stop. He pushed another 400 miles south, straight into Canaanite territory. After crossing the Jordan River at Sukkoth, he finally arrived at Shechem. And it's here the texts note he paused this massive migration just long enough to build his very first altar.
Moving just 20 miles further, he reached a geographically crucial spot, Bethel. He builds a second altar, offers more prayers. But the text indicates he actually couldn't stay. A severe famine struck Canaan, forcing him to keep moving just to keep his people alive.
That famine pushed Abraham into a 225-mile journey southwest, down into Egypt. It was a temporary detour in his epic narrative, sure, but absolutely a sheer survival tactic in what was a profoundly harsh ancient world.
Once conditions improved, he marched those exact 225 miles right back northeast to Bethel. But here they hit a breaking point. You see, Abraham and his nephew Lot had accumulated so much livestock that the herdsmen were literally fighting over grazing land. To keep the peace, they made the really difficult decision to separate right there at Bethel. And that specific location? It's deeply, deeply significant.
Section 2. Bethel, House of God. Bethel wasn't just some random rest stop on the map. Originally, it was a royal Canaanite city known as Luz, but it was renamed Bethel, which literally translates to House of God. It basically became the geographical and spiritual anchor for generations.
It was right here at Bethel, after that detour to Egypt, that God repeated the promise to give this land to Abraham's descendants. And generations later, this exact same spot is where Abraham's grandson, Jacob, famously dreamt of that ladder reaching all the way from earth to heaven.
But, as our sources show, Bethel's legacy is, well, it's pretty turbulent. It certainly didn't remain a pristine holy site. It morphed from Abraham's sacred altar into a heavily contested city conquered by Joshua. It became a center of national worship, yeah, but was later corrupted when King Jeroboam literally set up a golden calf for pagan worship. After being fiercely denounced by prophets for moral decay, its shrines were eventually reduced to rubble by King Josiah. So from sacred altar to golden calf to absolute rubble.
Section 3. The War in Canaan.
Establishing the history of this land brings us to its most controversial event. To get there, we actually have to fast forward 400 years. 4 whole centuries after God promised this territory to Abraham under the stars, his descendants, the Israelites, returned from Egypt to claim it.
And this is where modern readers usually hit a massive moral wall. In the ancient texts, they aren't just describing a standard border dispute here. They describe God explicitly ordering the absolute destruction of the Canaanite tribes. Why? How on earth do our sources justify such a severe, uncompromising command?
Well, the biblical historians break down their rationale into a few key areas. First, they actually view the Canaanites as illegal occupiers, arguing that God, as sovereign, had deeded this land to Abraham 400 years prior. Second, they describe a state of rampant, completely unchecked immorality. Third, and this is definitely the most shocking, the archaeological records cited point to horrific practices of child sacrifice, noting urns containing infants that were sacrificed to the god Baal. Therefore, the text framed this destruction not as some kind of blind rage, but as a severe spiritual quarantine, a quarantine designed to protect the Israelites and the future messianic bloodline from total corruption.
Section 4. Justice and Mercy.
To understand this impartially, we have to look at how the texts balance severe judgment with divine mercy. I know, those two concepts initially seem totally at odds, right? But the sources emphasize that God waited a full 400 years for the Canaanites to change, only acting when their sins were deemed full. Also, the destruction wasn't indiscriminate.
Individuals who repented, like Rahab, were spared. Entire groups who sought peace, like the Gibeonites, they were shown mercy too. The texts explicitly claim that God takes zero joy in the death of the wicked.
The theological texts actually capture this mindset through a really powerful medical metaphor. They compare the event to a surgeon amputating a gangrenous limb. Look, the surgeon doesn't want to cut off the arm, but if they don't, the rot spreads and the patient dies. In this framework, the destruction of the Canaanites is framed as an agonizing but absolutely necessary act to prevent a moral rot from completely extinguishing the spiritual future of humanity.
Ultimately, tracing this history, from Abraham's 600-mile treks, to the altars at Bethel, to the urns of Baal, and all the way to the surgeon's knife, leaves us to ponder something incredibly profound. How do these ancient records challenge our modern comfortable definitions of justice and mercy? It really forces us to ask, do true justice and ultimate sovereignty operate in ways that are just simply beyond our human comprehension?